This program is made possible by grants from the Bureau of Education for the Handicapped and from International Business Machines Corporation. The Captioned ABC News.
From ABC, this is World News Tonight with Bob Dyke in London, Max Robinson in Chicago, and from our desk in Washington, Frank Reynolds.
Good evening. In his first formal campaign speech as the Republican candidate for president, Ronald Reagan said today peace must be the highest priority of the United States, but not peace at any price. In a wide-ranging, slashing attack on the foreign and defense policies of the Carter administration, Reagan told the Veterans of Foreign Wars Convention in Chicago that President Carter's response to the Soviets has been weakness, inconsistency, vacillation, and bluff. Here's a report from Barry Serafin in Chicago.
It was, aides said, the real beginning of Reagan's fall campaign as the GOP nominee came to accept the Veterans of Foreign Wars' first presidential endorsement in 80 years. More than 4,000 VFW delegates were packed in the hall, including at least one ex-doughboy from World War I. Reagan castigated President Carter's policies toward veterans as well as foreign affairs and defense. His tone was restrained, but his words were tough as he responded to Carter administration charges that he wants a new arms race.
We're already in an arms race, but only the Soviets are racing. Soviet leaders talk arrogantly of a so-called correlation of forces that was moved in their favor, opening up opportunities for them to extend their influence. The response from the administration in Washington has been one of weakness, inconsistency, vacillation, and bluff.
Reagan said again today that he remains willing to negotiate arms control agreements with the Soviets, but not one-sided agreements. He got his biggest applause with some lines from his campaign 4 years ago, calling for an end to the, quote, Vietnam syndrome.
Well, it's time that we recognized ours was, in truth, a noble cause. And while we're at it, let us tell those who fought in that war that we will never again ask young men to fight and possibly die in a war our government is afraid to let them win.
Reagan began a new technique today in what aides call theme campaigning. He will stress foreign affairs all week. He will continue his attack on the administration's foreign and defense policies in a speech Wednesday before the American Legion in Boston, a day ahead of President Carter's appearance before the same group to defend his policies. Reagan knows that Mr. Carter's strategy is to portray him as someone likely to carry the U.S. into international confrontation, even war. But he and his advisors think the president has been too shrill and too early in charging recklessness, that the Democrats cannot make that charge stick all the way to November and cannot turn Ronald Reagan into Barry Goldwater. Barry Serafin, ABC News, Chicago.
There has been an unexpected development abroad that may in time affect the political campaign in this country. Polish workers in the Baltic area are standing firm in their strike against the government and may even be gaining support from workers in other parts of the country. Peter Jennings is on vacation. Here is Bob Dyke at our foreign desk in London.
Frank, it's a crisis which threatens Poland's current communist political system. It began weeks ago with a series of wildcat strikes to protest rising food prices and to demand higher pay. The strikes have been spreading, and the issues have broadened to include a long list of social and political grievances. Tonight, Poland's Communist Party leader, Edvard Gierek, went on television and said, "We will not tolerate strikes." With the first of two reports on the crisis, here is Charles Bierbauer.
The strike that idled the major port of Gdansk and the important Lenin shipyard is serious enough for Polish Communist Party chief Edward Gierek to have abruptly canceled this week's planned visit to West Germany and to have strongly warned the Polish nation that a challenge to the socialist system will not be tolerated. The demands of the striking Polish workers in Gdansk included a free press, release of political prisoners, and the right to strike, even though these workers had assumed the risk of striking illegally. This was a major step beyond the cries for more meat and more money, which until now is what Poles in other cities had demanded. In his TV speech, Gierek had some sympathy for the Poles' everyday life of lines and shortages, but he had little promise of an early change. Poland's most outspoken dissident, Jacek Kuron, says the strikers cannot think of overthrowing the government so long as it is supported by Soviet tanks. But Kuron hopes the strikes will force political reform. 10 years ago, Gierek was put in power after workers rioted in protest of rising prices. The riots were worst in this same port of Gdansk. So there is reason for the Polish government to worry when the workers seize the boardrooms and ask for changes in the system founded by Lenin. There is reason, too, for the Poles to worry because Soviet troops were used to halt strikes in Poland in the 1950s and most recently to end liberal ideas in Czechoslovakia in 1968. Charles Bierbauer, ABC News.
This is John Scally. The deepening labor unrest in Poland is creating a massive crisis of the same dimensions which swept the last Polish government out of office. This is the view of top U.S. intelligence authorities who were warning that the outcome is as unpredictable now as it was during the 1970 riots which left wreckage reminiscent of war. While both strike leaders and government officials are seeking to avoid a bloody showdown, intelligence experts believe that an unforeseen incident could trigger new violence. A State Department spokesman emphasized today that the U.S. was closely following developments but keeping a hands-off attitude.
Domestic problems in Poland are a matter for the Polish people and Polish authorities to work out. We do not believe that any further comment from the United States government would be helpful.
Top U.S. officials see no sign that Soviet authorities are preparing to intervene, even though strikers have escalated their demands to include unprecedented political freedoms. Any anti-Russian uprising will almost certainly bring Russian military intervention, experts believe, but not a confrontation which would force the present Polish government out and put another pro-Soviet regime in its place. John Scally, ABC News, Washington.
From Moscow, there are unconfirmed reports from diplomatic sources that Premier Alexei Kosygin may be gravely ill. Those are the words allegedly used by the Soviet Foreign Ministry to explain why this week's scheduled meeting between Kosygin and Singapore's Prime Minister was suddenly canceled. Iran's Foreign Minister Gopsadeh today told the British to release a group of Iranian exiles jailed earlier this month during a violent demonstration outside the U.S. Embassy here in London. Anglo-Iranian relations worsened with the arrest of a British newspaper reporter in Tehran. He and 3 other British subjects have been accused of spying, the same sort of charge that was leveled at the American hostages who are now in their 289th day of captivity. Max?
Thank you, Bob. Across the country today, federal marshals were back riding the nation's airliners. Coming up, we'll have the story of increased security at airports in the wake of last week's 6 hijackings. And we'll have the story of Broadway Joe, who's gone about as far off Broadway as you can get. If you took a flight today, you know that airport security officials are really cracking down. Luggage is being inspected much more frequently by hand. At the Newark, New Jersey airport, for example, this man was detained for carrying a gun. He said he was a businessman carrying large sums of money and needed it for his safety. All the security is the result of events of the past week during which 6 jetliners were hijacked to Cuba. We have reports beginning with Bob Serkin.
These 2 Cuban refugees were arraigned before a U.S. magistrate in Miami this morning. They are charged with conspiracy, attempted air piracy, and attempted destruction of an airplane. Yesterday, they tried sneaking bottles of gasoline aboard an Air Florida plane they wanted to hijack to Havana. Bond was set at $1 million for each man. Here at Miami International Airport, extraordinary security measures remain in effect under the threat that more Cuban refugees have said they will try to